For entrepreneurial thinkers. I'm your host, Patrick J. McGinnis. And today we are talking to William Green, the author of Richer, Wiser, Happier: How the World's Greatest Investors Win in Markets and Life, which is just coming out in paperback. Now, I got to say this, like Charlie Munger, the famed Charlie Munger, said of this book, quote, one of the best investing books ever written, end quote. That, my friends, is an endorsement. Now, William has written for many publications in the US and Europe, including Time, Fortune, Forbes, Fast Company, The New Yorker, The Spectator, and The Economist. He edited the Asian edition of Time while living in Hong Kong, then moved to London to edit the European, Middle Eastern, and African editions of Time. Born and raised in London, he studied English literature at Oxford and received a master's degree in journalism at Columbia. He lives in New York with his wife, the 2 children, and apparently a dog. Welcome to the show, William.
Hi, it's lovely to be here with you, Patrick.
You know, just having a British person on the show just makes it sound classy. So
I'm really probably from the Bronx, but I'm putting on this fake accent just to impress you.
Yeah, it's like, no, I'm actually from Birmingham. I'm a Brummie. I was there this year. Strange place. Okay, so let's get started. I start the show with every time with the same question, and you are not escaping me. The question is this: tell me something unexpected you learned about yourself that changed everything.
Well, I'm 56 years old, and one of the most unexpected things is that I've gone through this kind of odd spiritual journey where I started off being reasonably conventionally observant as a Jewish kid who was forced to go to, not forced, but somewhat obliged to go to synagogue. Then I lost all of my faith and became an agnostic, and then became sort of agnostic, then tipped over into being an atheist. And then when I hit about 40, much to my surprise, I started to become increasingly spiritual. And part of it was that I ran into a guy in London who seemed incredibly free. And I thought, how the hell did he get so free? What happened? And that sort of tipped me into this strange journey. And I think I'm not saying any of this in a way to sort of proselytize. It's more that we don't even know ourselves. I mean, the fact that this sort of jaded, cynical atheist who thought it was kind of puerile to believe in anything, have found increasingly actually that I'm on this kind of weird spiritual journey is so unexpected. So I think I've learned just not to trust my own judgment at all, because I have no idea who I am, let alone anything else.
I heard this quote the other day. I think it was in a movie, but I can't remember. Just about like certainty is the enemy of all good things. Being certain, you just become closed-minded. It's like it sounds what you're saying is that you accept the fact that you're always going to be seeking and learning as you go along. Which is
and always sort of
great.
surprised by my own journey. Like, I just don't know. I mean, even this year, I started studying with this extraordinary woman who's the oracle of the Tibetan government in exile. And she's unbelievable. It never, I spent all these years studying Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah and things like that, which is still like very, very central to my life. And then I go off on this odd jaunt studying really esoteric Tibetan Buddhism. And so it just makes me think I have so little control over anything and so little certitude about anything. And I think that's probably not a bad position to be in as a writer, just always curious, always exploring.
It strikes me when I got the pitch for this book, I was like, oh, a book about investing. Well, that's great. And we like that on FOMO Sapiens. And we've had books about investing before. And then you're coming at me with Jewish mysticism and esoteric Buddhism. So just as we get started in this conversation, talk about why you wrote this book and what you are hoping to impart with this book.
Well, in a way, it's not that disconnected from the esoteric mysticism and Tibetan Buddhism, because really what it's all about is me trying to figure out how to live. It's trying to figure out through my writing and through my interviews with famous investors, how the hell are we supposed to find our way in an incredibly confusing world where we don't know very much and where the future is unknowable. And so I just was in this strange position where I got to interview a lot of the greatest investors of all time. And so I could ask them these questions. And so I could go to someone like Howard Marks, who oversees something like $200 billion and who's obsessed with Zen Buddhism and this idea of mujo, of impermanence, and the fact that everything is changing. And I could say to him, well, so if everything is changing, how do you invest in the future? Like, how do you make decisions about the future? How do you decide where to live? How do you? And so he would start talking about things like the fact that because the future is unknowable, what you have to do is stop trying to predict the future, and instead you accommodate yourself to reality as it is. And so you think about an idea like that, that has deep ramifications for everything that we do. So you look at the stock market or the economy and you say, okay, so if everyone is taking crazy risk and they're all really complacent and they assume that the future is going to be glorious because the last few years have been glorious for stocks and for big cap tech stocks, Howard will look at it and say, well, actually, that means the conditions are pretty icy because everyone's taking too much risk and they're sort of doing the equivalent of driving without a seatbelt really fast in the fog. And so he would say, well, so I'm going to accommodate myself to reality as it is and drive more carefully. I'm going to invest more carefully. And so you apply these ideas to everything in life, and it starts to be very practically helpful, because I think I was listening to one of your episodes, the one on flourishing on Martin Seligman, and I could see like you're very interested in the practicality of anything that's based on scientific research,
Yeah.
and it gives a kind of validation. And in the same way, I look at these great investors and I think, well, these are practical people. These are people who, if their ideas suck, they're going to lose billions of dollars. And so I like the fact that you can road test these ideas. It's not just theory. It's looking at the very real world of business and investing and saying, do these ideas actually have some validity? And if they don't, then these guys are going to sooner or later come undone.
I saw Howard Marks speak a couple years back, and I'm glad you brought him into this conversation, because I actually, I'd heard the name, but I saw him speak at this conference, and I remember thinking that I was in the presence of greatness, because just everything he said, that kind of person who says stuff that you wouldn't have thought of, but when they say it, it feels like you've known it forever kind of stuff. He just has that kind of power. And he was talking about the fact that things are never in the markets, like things are never as bad as people think they are or as good as they think they are. Right. And that there's sort of these animal spirits running around. And it stuck with me what he talked about. Now, I'm curious, like you had the opportunity to spend time with these extraordinary people. And I'm curious if you see patterns that you were able to tease out of what makes them so good at what they do.
One of the most obvious things that connects all of them is that they think in terms of probabilities. So again, this gets to the idea of not having any certainty about anything. They're looking at the world as this kind of distribution of probabilities. So Howard, for example, during the global financial crisis, at a certain point, he said, well, there are all of these people who are acting as if the world is going to end. But he said, most of the time, the world doesn't end. And so he said, given that everybody is incredibly pessimistic and that fear is probably priced into the market, I would be reckless if I failed to buy now. And so he made a bunch of investments in toxic bonds and companies that everyone hated, and made something like $8 or $9 billion during that period. So it's a very philosophical position in a way, right? To sort of say, I don't know what the future holds. None of us do, but the odds suggest that it's going to go this way, and then always hedging in case you're wrong, right? So I remember there's a guy called Jeffrey Gundlach, who's often described as the king of bonds, who was managing about $140 billion when I interviewed him. And he said to me, look, because I'm wrong about a third of the time, he said, the question I always have to ask before I make any investment is, what's the consequence if I'm wrong? And so that way of thinking in terms of probabilities, and also thinking about, if I'm wrong, will I get knocked out of the game? Will I just not survive? That's very typical of these people. They're very rational, very unemotional. I mean, I once said to Howard Marks, I knew that he'd been divorced and was married a second time, and I said to him, were you always unemotional? And he said, oh yes. And I said, has it been a problem for you in your relationships? And he said, oh yes, particularly in my first marriage. And he said, I've got a lot better at it more recently. But you always had this sense that a lot of the really great investors were sort of like superior machines, right? They they were great at thinking about probability, but they weren't necessarily the best with human relationships. But then there were exceptions, right? I mean, then there are some who, you know, are much more emotional and are much more like the rest of us. And that's problematic in certain ways. I mean, there's a guy called Tom Gaynor who runs a company called Markel, where he has about 20,000 employees. And he said to me, we were talking about the financial crisis, and he said, I lost all of my hair. And he's very self-mocking and self-deprecating. And I thought he was joking. He's like, no, I'm serious. I lost all of my hair.
Well, I ended up on a heart monitor, so I get that. Like,
Huh.
he and I could talk about that together. I guess it was pretty, but like, yeah, the stress of the financial crisis, definitely, I can see, I get that. Talking about adversity, one thing it makes me think of as we talk about Munger and we talk about other these kind of icons is I always was very interested in. I remember the 2000 tech bubble, and I was a baby venture capitalist investing in really stupid ideas. And I remember Buffett getting a lot of heat because he was just like, I don't believe in this stuff. I think it's all smoke and mirrors, and I'm sticking to my knitting. I'm going to stay doing what I do. And people were like, the old man is washed up. Like, put him out to pasture. He's done. And he took a lot of heat, but he, in the end, was proven right when all those companies disappeared. And obviously, Berkshire Hathaway is doing great. It took a level of, well, it took a couple of things. It took, number one, not caring what other people think to some degree. It took the ability to deal with, an adverse set of circumstances. And in the end, he was proven right. But, that is, you've mentioned about this risk and probability, but it doesn't always go your way. Like, how do these investors channel and adapt to adversity in their lives and in their work?
Yeah, it's a hugely important question. There's an extraordinary investor called Bill Miller who I've interviewed for the best part of 100 hours over the last 25 years, and he was the greatest mutual fund manager of his generation, and then kind of blew up during the financial crisis, and then since then has had an unbelievable recovery. And when I first interviewed him back in about 2000, 2001, he had built he had bought 15% of Amazon, which most people thought was going to go bankrupt back then. I mean, so he was incredibly contrarian. And I remember saying to him back then, boy, you've really got to have balls to do what you do. And he said, yeah, but I've also got to be right. And that's what's so difficult. It's like you have to have both of those things. You have to have this ability to diverge from the crowd, which requires incredible strength of conviction and intelligence and independence of mind. But then you've also got to be right. And so he got clobbered during the financial crisis because he was wrong. And more than 100 people lost their jobs because of a mistake that he made. And he said to me, look, I put on 40 pounds during the financial crisis. And he's not an emotional guy. And I said to him, how come you put on so much weight? And he said, look, during really difficult times, I'm not going to eat salmon and broccoli and drink Perrier. He's like, a man can only take so much pain. But he said to me, when he had figured out like how to deal with the pain of the financial crisis, what he was doing, because he's actually a philosopher. I mean, he's given something like $75 million to the philosophy department at Johns Hopkins, where he did his PhD work. And so he was drawing on Stoicism very seriously. So what he was saying is, look, one of the great lessons from the Stoics is you have to focus on what you can control and let go of the rest. And so he said, I don't have any control over what people say about me on the internet and people ridiculing me and saying I'm a fool and stuff like that. But he said, I do have control over admitting my mistakes, over being honest about learning from my mistakes, about trying to get back the money for the people who actually trusted me and stayed with me. And that was very inspiring for me because during the financial crisis, I had been editing the European, Middle East, and African edition of Time. And I got laid off in the middle of the financial crisis when the magazine business got killed. And so when I was going to talk to someone like Bill about resilience, I was really looking for advice because I felt that sense of shame and failure. And so for me, there was something very inspiring about Bill's strength and grace under fire. Like the fact that here was a guy who had been this kind of superhero who felt like, the world treated him like he could do no wrong. And I said to him at one point, we were in his garden at his home in Maryland. It's a pretty amazing mansion. And I said, in retrospect, are you kind of glad you went through the financial crisis, that you went through this fire and everything kind of fell apart in certain ways? And he's like, Yeah, it was kind of cathartic because he said, when you go through when you're like the star and you're right, and everyone thinks you're a hero, you get invited on CNBC and stuff to talk about things you don't really know about, and when you fail so publicly, nobody wants to talk to you, and it's really good for your ego. And so it reminds me also. I mean, you think of the episode you just did about Viktor Frankl, where you talk about overcoming ego, and so I think with all of these people, you can sort of you look at the lives of these very successful people and you see the same lessons running through them, right? I mean, you know the sense of having to overcome your ego, the sense of having to build a life where you share with other people, having to make a contribution, having to have sort of equanimity through thick and thin. I mean, it's an incredible laboratory, the financial markets, for seeing what works in life. I mean, Munger said, I observe what works and doesn't work and why. And so that's why I'm so fascinated by these guys. They're a very real world pragmatic test case for actually what works in life.
It's interesting to talk about, that hero to zero flip that you just talked about. It reminds me, as you were talking, I was thrown back into when I was a first year, back to the financial crisis again, or sorry, the early days of tech. I was in Brazil working down there for my firm, and the woman who was running our group was on the cover of Veja, which is one of the big magazines there. And I was like, wow, geez, I was so impressed. And I had this colleague whose family had a bank that went bankrupt, and they'd been through a lot of strife. And he was like, the minute you're on the cover of the magazine, that's bad, because like you got a target on your back and like you're just going down. And sure enough, like everything blew up and she was like out of a job. And I remember thinking like, and later on, as you do more media and stuff, you get some of these opportunities. And I remember it's always kept me humble, because I'm like, yeah, so you're in some article somewhere. Like that doesn't mean that, that doesn't mean anything. You could be out on the street a week later, and if you're drawing your self-esteem from external validation, even though like it's tempting and it feels good and all that, but if you lose focus of what really matters, it's coming for you. Like nobody stays on top forever, even except for like maybe Madonna and Miles Davis, but everybody else has to revert back to earth at some point or another. Now, I want to talk a little bit about, instant gratification, because I think one of the things that we live in a world of instant gratification. I think we can all admit it. I certainly love it as well. But these investors, they have to be patient, and they have to wait for the probability that they're calculating to pay off. So, talk about that kind of rigor and how it fits into these folks.
Yeah, there's an extraordinary English duo that I write about in one of the chapters. It's called Nick and Zach's Excellent Adventure, and it's about these
I like
two,
that.
these two almost unknown hedge fund managers who've become kind of stars and legends because of the book, because they'd never even given an interview. I mean, they were so under the radar before they ended up talking to me about their lives. And they're this beautiful example of deferred gratification in action, because they set themselves up as Nick Sleep, one of the two, said to me that they just rejected what he called the sin and folly of Wall Street. So they looked at all of the stupid, ephemeral, short-term nonsense that Wall Street was engaged in, and they said, well, we're not doing that. So this influenced everything, right? They would say, well, everyone else is doing what they would call wiggle guessing, where they're just trying to guess which way the market's going to go, and is the economy going to rebound in the shape of a V or a Y or a Nike swoosh or whatever it is. And they're just like, it's just bullshit. We're just not looking at that stuff. We're just so not interested in that. And so what they started to do is what they would call destination analysis, where they would say, okay, what's a good destination for this business over 10, 20 more years? And is the CEO, is the top management making decisions that are going to lead to this happy destination? And so they would focus on the inputs that are going to get you there, right? So they ended up, basically, Nick had a 3-stock portfolio, all of his fortune in Costco, Amazon, and Berkshire, because he said, look, these are companies that are totally countercultural. They're investing for the long term. They're trying to make sure that their customers are okay. They're trying to drive down costs. They don't care about having really fat margins. They use this model that they described as scale economies shared. So as they grew, they would give those benefits of their growth back to the customer, so that instead of their size becoming a kind of anchor, it actually became a strength because it allowed them to kind of have this benevolent cycle. And so that all requires a kind of deferred gratification. And they did this in every area of the way they ran their business. They kept making their fee structure less and less attractive and lucrative for themselves and more attractive for their shareholders. And so I think if there's a takeaway for the rest of us, it's really to say, in a society that it's increasingly addicted to these short-term dopamine hits from everything from our news feeds on our phone to fast food to just the abundance of everything. Really, the competitive advantage is to kind of be totally countercultural and say, let me think of very long-term destinations and then work backwards. And so you can apply it to your own life. You can sort of say, well, okay, if I want to look back at the end of a long life and say, wow, that was an amazing ride, what would the inputs be that would get you there? So you start to think, okay, so I've got to invest in my health. I've got to invest in my relationships. I've got to invest in my peace of mind. I've got to invest in contributing to other people so I help them. I've got to lift up other people in some way. And if all I'm doing is maximizing my bank account, it's going to be a really stunted life. So I think the whole thing becomes a kind of curious experiment in setting yourself up to be the opposite of all the short-termists who are surrounding us.
It makes me think about, you ask like a kid coming out of college, what are your goals? And they're like, well, I just want to make a ton of money. And, maybe they will, but, statistics tell me that especially if you want to be a YouTuber or a footballer, like your chances of success, not that high. And it makes me think, we were talking in the green room about the concept of expectations versus reality and how they drive happiness. I'd love to just get your analysis, of how you think, first of all, what is the driver of quote unquote happiness? I mean, that word is loaded, but also how do we balance expectation and reality in that equation of seeking happiness?
Yeah, it's funny. Munger, Charlie Munger, who was Buffett's partner, who died a little over a year ago at the age of 99, about a month before his 100th birthday, had this very dry, kind of sardonic wit, and he talked about how the secret of a happy marriage was low expectations, and I think to some degree that's
so
right.
Romantic.
Like, it is, but to some, I've tried this on my wife to tell her this, but she doesn't seem very impressed with my analysis. She thinks I should just behave better. But I don't know. I think a lot about this whole question of what's actually going to make for a truly rich and abundant life, because in some ways, if you think about it, I've interviewed all of these people who won the jackpot, right? I mean, so many super rich people who have yachts and mansions and art collections and the like. And so really the question that I tried to answer in the epilogue of the book is, okay, so what actually makes for a rich life? Like, if, did the money do it for them or not really? And I think it's a pretty nuanced answer. I mean, I don't dismiss the value of having money, because I remember what it was like when I got laid off during the financial crisis. And I had 2 young kids in private school in England and really expensive rent. And I can tell you, it kind of sucked. Like, to have that sort of corrosive fear over what the future would bring is not great. So I think you want to have money because it gives you optionality. You want to have money, in my experience from interviewing all of these great investors, because it gives you independence. It gives you this ability to structure your life so that you can live it in a way that's true to who you are. That seems to me an inestimable benefit. I mean, I see this again and again, right? That it's a great deal of it is about living in a way that's aligned with who you are in all of your weirdness and idiosyncrasy, right? So there's one guy I wrote about who I interviewed when he was 108, shortly before he died at the age of 109. And he was still commuting to his office in Midtown Manhattan well after turning 100. And finally, his kids and grandkids had to persuade him that he should take a taxi or a limo instead of going on the bus. I mean, because he was like 107 at that point. And, for most of us, the idea of commuting to a skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan at the age of 108 is not the idea of a happy ending. But for him, he just loved solving puzzles. He loved going to the office. He loved working with his son and his grandson. He loved the fact that he created a business that was serving people and helped them achieve financial independence. And he didn't really care about, going to fancy restaurants and stuff. Like, it just wasn't of interest to him. The only thing that he spent a lot of money on was books. And so I think that, again, the lesson for people like you and me and our listeners is really to have the self-awareness to say, okay, what's a really rich life to me? And so for someone like me, I think through the process of writing the book, I increasingly came to realize I just don't want to work for anyone I dislike ever again. Like, just that is so important to me. I was interviewing Pico Iyer, the author and travel writer, the other day, and he once had flirted with the idea of becoming a monk, and he said to me, I could have handled the sexual abstinence and stuff, but he's like, the obedience, I could never have handled the obedience. And I'm the same. I'm just not an obedient person. And so just knowing that I'm never going to be really suited to work for some big organization where I have to obey people is very helpful. And in some ways, I wish I had known that 25 years ago. It would have been kind of helpful.
Oh my God, me too. What I'm taking away from this too is it's like, it's really tempting. We play this game with my mom and dad. They buy a lottery ticket every week. That's like a thing. And then they talk about what would they do with the money. And it's always like a list of stuff that they would buy, which I appreciate. And they want to basically give it to me and my brother, like buy us all stuff, which is so nice. They don't want anything for themselves. But as I think about if you dropped $1 billion on me or whatever, not even billion, like, I don't know, 100 million or whatever the number is, it's like, I wouldn't really, it's like, I'm not thinking about, like, I would start a fund and invest in cool things and whatever. It's like less about like what you buy and more about what you, I don't know, what you do to make your life more interesting and to benefit from that flexibility and benefit from that currency, as it were. So that just kind of shows you, because obviously we all know, like, more stuff, like I don't want any more stuff. Like, I threw away 15 trash bags on New Year's Day of stuff I didn't want anymore. That was like, I just don't even know what to do with this. So it's not stuff that makes you happy. You have to have the basics, obviously.
There's an extraordinary guy who I actually end the book with, a guy called Arnold Vandenberg, because I write that he's not necessarily the most successful investor I've ever met, but he's the most successful human being I've ever met in the investing business. And he's not dissimilar to Viktor Frankl. I mean, his parents were in Auschwitz, and he was in an orphanage during his childhood, being hidden away in a Catholic orphanage as a little boy, because he was born on the same street as Anne Frank in wow. Amsterdam. And he's such an incredible embodiment of how to have a rich and happy life. And he called me yesterday because I have a book launch party coming up in a few days in New York City. And he called to say, I can't come for personal reasons. I'm so sorry, because I really would want to come from Texas to be there with you. And we start chatting, and he's become a great mentor to me. And he says to me at the end what he'd said a week or so ago, a couple of weeks ago when we talked, where he just said, William, thank you so much. You've just really helped to help me to fulfill the dream of my life by writing about me in my book, because you don't know how many people I've been able to help because of your book, because so many people have approached him and he's been able to teach them stuff. And just when you see the joy of this guy in his mid-80s, when he's so alive and so vibrant, and the thing that's making him joyful literally is the fact that he's fulfilling his dream of helping other people. Wow. And that gives you such it's such a vivid sort of example of what you were saying in your episodes on flourishing about Martin Seligman, and also your episode about Viktor Frankl. There's got to be some purpose beyond our own ego. And I think one of the things that I like about studying the great investors is they're so unromantic about this, right? I mean, they're not these great kind of airy-fairy spiritual figures, who I also admire a great deal. They're these great pragmatists who are saying, well, how am I actually going to have a happy life? Well, I better serve other people. I better lift up other people. If it's just going to be about making myself as rich as possible, I'm not actually going to be very happy. And so for me, in a way, and this connects us back to my very first answer in our discussion, is the book is a kind of stealth spiritual exercise, because really what you're doing is you're saying, so what actually works for a happy life? What actually is going to make you rich? And then you start to come up with these ideas of, oh, okay, so I'm going to have to pay attention to my peace of mind, because if I'm incredibly rich but I have no peace of mind, it's going to be a horror show. I'm going to have to pay attention to helping other people and lifting up other people, because if I don't have a sense of purpose, my life's going to be really stunted, because it's all going to be about like getting a bigger yacht, which is kind of, we know is going to leave us feeling void. I'm going to have to defer gratification, because if it's all just about instant gratification, there's going to be some sort of short circuit, because that just doesn't work, right? And so in a way, it's like you're just uncovering the principles of what works in life, but you're finding them in a different microcosm of markets and business. So what Viktor Frankl was doing was finding them in the Holocaust, right? I mean, he was gaining control over his thoughts, right? He was thinking about, you remember when he talked about how the space between stimulus and response is where you have freedom, because that's where you have the choice over how to react. Yeah. So I look at someone like Arnold Vandenberg, and he's someone who so totally embodies that, right? Because he came out of World War II having lost 39 family members in the Holocaust, and he was so full of rage and anger, and he just gradually turned himself into this incredibly kind, loving human being, and he did it very consciously. I mean, when he would literally just keep saying to himself things like, "No, I'm a loving person," and so at a certain point, he sort of actually rewired his mind. So I look at people like that, and I just think, well, okay, so if I'm trying to figure out how to build a rich and abundant life myself, I'm going to have to get control over my inner landscape, because otherwise, however many followers I get, or however many book sales I get, or however much validation I get from my peers or from my mom or whoever it might be, I'm still going to feel kind of empty. And so I think it's really helpful for all of us to sort of study lives that worked and see what parts of them we want to basically clone, reverse engineer and clone. But then at the same time, do what Charlie Munger did, which is to look at what doesn't work. Because it's actually incredibly easy, as he would explain, to figure out what doesn't work and just avoid that. So you want to solve the problem forwards by saying, yeah, these are the principles that kind of work. But then at the same time say, well, so if I wanted to have a really unhappy life, what would I do? If I wanted to be a really unsuccessful investor, what would I do? And Munger's point is that that's pretty easy to identify. So then you just start to look around you and you say, okay, well, so everyone I know who has a really crappy life, like they're lazy, they're unpunctual, they don't have a drive, they're just out for themselves, they're always complaining about stuff, they're self-pitying, they're envious, and you look at that stuff and you're like, well, it's pretty obvious. So Munger would just say, so let me not do that.
Yeah, that's such a smart frame. What a great idea. Look at what you don't want to be and do the opposite. All right, are you ready?
I am.
The lightning round.
I don't know what I'm ready for, but I'm ready. Yeah.
I wish I had like special effects right now, but
yeah.
Budget cuts. The lightning round, 4 quick questions, 4 quick answers. Ready?
Good luck. Have you ever heard me give a quick answer to anything? But listen, it's the triumph of hope over experience.
It's like they're woven, and they're. I enjoyed all of it. Okay, ready. Number 1. What's a favorite quote?
The one that came to my mind in that second is there's a beautiful one from this ancient poet called Kalidasa that's in Sanskrit, which is something along the lines of, look to this day, for it is life, the very life of life. In its brief course, like all the verities and realities of your existence, the bliss of growth, the glory of action, the splendor of beauty. For yesterday is only a vision and tomorrow is only a dream. But today well lived makes every yesterday a vision of hope and every tomorrow a dream of happiness. Look therefore to this day.
Wow.
Such is the salutation to the dawn. I think that's what it is. And I taught that to my daughter Madeline when she was very young, and she then recited it at a school in London. And I think it's beautiful because it reminds you that it's all about today. You got to somehow yank yourself back to today, because you have a little bit more control over that than over the distant future.
See, audience, this is what you get when you go to Oxford. You can do poetries, and that felt very Oxford to me, and I loved it. Thank you. Okay, number 2, for a radical change of tone, what's your favorite use case of Chat GPT?
Um, you'd be shocked to know how much I test ChatGPT on questions to do with Hebrew and Aramaic, and so I'll I'll ask it a question. So last night I couldn't sleep last night, and I woke up at about 4 in the morning. And one of the reasons I woke up was because I had this line from the Hanukkah songs going through my head, and I was like, "What the hell does this phrase mean? Because why does it keep going through my head?" And so I asked ChatGPT, and what it basically meant was um, um, it was honor, music, and something else. And so it was sort of I don't know, it's such a strange phrase. And so I'm always asking things like that. I'll say things like I'll suddenly think about the phrase "be still and know God," and I'm like, what does that come from in Psalms? What's the origin? Because then I'll start thinking, well, so it's kind of meditative, right? In so there's some link between that and the Tibetan Buddhism that I'm studying, because it's like, okay, so if I just sit, could I just think of it as I'm just watching the flow of light, like I'm just watching the play of light, the dance of light. And so maybe even though the Buddhists weren't ever talking about God, maybe that is what they're talking about. Maybe it's just watching God. So I go off on these weird tangents and fall down rabbit holes. So this is, but I'll give you one practical thing to do from this.
Okay.
Is a friend of mine, Todd Morgan, said that you should ask ChatGPT, what do you know about me based on my searches that I might not
Oh
know
yeah,
about
I've done
myself?
that 100%, and it knows me. It's
It's
wonderful.
crazy.
Ah, you know what? I will tell you of something I discovered the other day. I was using it for some Portuguese language translation. I spoke to it in Portuguese,
Huh.
and it speaks right back to you in Portuguese.
Wow.
Like it knows to go into the other language, so it's great for language practice. Actually,
Yeah.
really like that, and it's with a British accent. I mean, I use the British guy. I guess I just wanted to sound like you, so it's like
Ah,
it's like I have a butler, but my butler speaks Portuguese.
I should have been a butler. I've missed my
It's not.
calling.
No, that's the next part of your career. Number three,
Excellent.
one piece of advice you'd give to your younger self.
I would have been much more hopeful, I think. I think I've spent a great deal of my life worrying. And there's a beautiful line from Montaigne, the French philosopher, who said something along the lines of, my life has been full of disasters, most of which never happened. And I think that's the problem. You spend so much of your life worrying about what's going to happen. And then actually, my life's, thank God, been really pretty good. And I don't think the worry and anxiety have helped that much. I think they're a very powerful survival mechanism, but I think they're good for survival and getting ahead and kind of furthering the good of the species in some way, but I don't think they're very good for happiness. And so I think there's been some sort of rewiring. And maybe this gets at what you were discovering when you were reading Seligman and all that stuff about positive psychology is I think it's very helpful actually to start saying to yourself, there's a beautiful Hebrew phrase, gamsula tova, which basically translates as, and this too is for the best. And so I think just rewiring yourself to think, no, even this terrible stuff that I'm going through right now is in some way for my benefit, even if that's not true. It almost becomes true. And so I think that's a big part of what I've done over the last few years is try to sort of rewire myself to think, I don't want to just spend my life worrying. I'd rather, maybe it makes you seem sort of stupid and naive to be positive, but actually I think there's great wisdom in it.
Yeah, that's why I think those books resonate with me. As I listen to you talk, I felt validated because I've always been this way. I'm like people are always like, you're the most optimistic person I know. And I'm always like, why not? And, I don't, it's just who I am, right? For many different, the tapestry of life. But when I read those books, I was like, oh, like, okay, so this is a good thing that I should cultivate. Okay, great. Like I can do that. This is easy for me. Like, boom, I'll just be me.
There's a guy you ought to interview, a guy called Brad Stulberg, who came on my podcast, and he talked in a very interesting way about the dangers of toxic positivity.
Oh,
and
yes.
he quoted the Frankel phrase that you loved also about tragic optimism, which I think is a beautiful idea. And one of the things that Brad said to me is, look, there are times in life where something just sucks. Like if you lose a kid, God forbid, or really terrible things, really terrible pain and illness and stuff. He's like, you don't want to be telling people, no, this is for your good, and just see that you'll see that there's a. He's like, sometimes you just have to show up, and that's enough. But I do think there's this sort of, and I think that's true, but I think the highest level of consciousness in a way is, you think of someone like that. There's this legendary story of Rabbi Akiva, who 2,000 years ago, as he watched the temple burn, he starts to dance. And there's something so extraordinary. I think that's sort of the height of consciousness that we can get to, is in the moment where you're getting the crap kicked out of you. You're like, no, I don't believe this. This is only light because there is only light. And so I think in some way, this is what we're kind of trying to work towards, but it seems sort of irrational.
All right, number 4. What is your most important memory? By the way, this is the longest lightning round in the history of the show, but you're giving us good content in a British accent, so we allow it.
Sorry, my most important memory.
Yeah.
I tell you, a really great memory from the last year is I went on a 6-day silent retreat, which, as you can imagine, is a difficult thing for me to be silent. And then I really enjoyed it. And so I said to my son, Henry, who's 26, would you ever go on a silent retreat with this great Tibetan Buddhist teacher, Sopna Rinpoche? And he said, I would go with you. And so I dropped everything and I went on a 6-day silent retreat with my son. I have to say, sitting in silence for 6 days with your kid, who, like me, is a sort of smart aleck, and we're sitting there kind of making wisecracks on a piece of paper without saying them out loud, was just a real delight. And so I think it gets the idea that, like, true happiness is going to involve relationships. It's just going to. It's going to involve doing interesting things with the people you love.
That sounds amazing. All right, everybody, if you like what you heard, which you did, I know, because I know you guys, you can find more of William on x.com, former Twitter, William Green 72. You can find him on LinkedIn at William Green, Richer, Wiser, Happier. And you can find the book, which is now out on paperback, Richer, Wiser, Happier, How the World's Greatest Investors Win in Markets and Life. William Green, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's been a real delight.
Amazing. Hey, where did